Welcome to another episode of the Inquisitive Mind of Lewis T podcast, IMoLT podcast. Make sure you hit subscribe, like, and all that stuff below. We're doing another spotlight. So instead of doing a deep dive on a subject with a panel, we're still going to do a deep dive on a subject. So we're not doing a deep dive. I know a couple of the episodes have been a deep dive on a person. We're not going to deep dive on this person's life, which is probably is equally interesting, but we're just going to kind of deep dive on a couple of topics. We are actually going to deep dive on some of the what would you say, the misconceptions?
Misconceptions and myths.
Of the trans community. So I'm going to let my guests introduce who they are and their title and all that stuff.
Thanks, Lewis.
Yeah.
So my name is Lindsey Lughes. I am the Executive Director of the LGBT Center of Raleigh.
Raleigh, North Carolina.
Raleigh, North Carolina, correct. And obviously, we've known each other forever. And so you know that I've always been really active in various causes. But over the past 7 or 8 years, I've mostly been focused on LGBTQ identities and issues.
All right. So the first thing I want to say, so what exactly is the acronym and what does it stand for?
That's a great question. So we say we're the LGBT Center of Raleigh, but I will say that LGBT is not probably the most current way to use the acronym. But to go ahead and define that, so L will be for lesbian. So typically when we're referring to lesbians, we're referering to women who are attracted romantically, physically to other women.
Mm-hmm.
G for gay. Now, gay, historically, we thought about it being men who are attracted to other men, but gay has really become a language used pretty broadly by a number of folks who may have same gender attraction.
Yeah,
so
that's kind of like the generic term.
Right.
Okay.
You hear women, non-binary folks, lots of people refer to themselves as gay now.
Mm-hmm.
B for bisexual. So bisexual being somebody who's attracted to one or more genders. T for transgender. So transgender being the part of the acronym that doesn't quite fit, because with the L, G, and B, we're talking about sexual orientation, and with T, we're talking about gender identity. Mm-hmm. So transgender is somebody who does not identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. Mm-hmm. So often you hear LGBTQ, like the center in Durham has an LGBTQ Center of Durham. So that Q is tacked on for kind of the more current language. Q, often we said Q was for questioning. Now we think of Q more as for queer. And queer is really reclamation language. So a lot of people...
When you say reclamation language, let's slow down.
Sure, yeah, no problem. So a lot of people think of queer as being a slur. For a long time, queer was used as a slur. Occasionally, it could still be used in a derogatory way. But the LGBT communities, a lot of younger folks especially, have really taken that word back, and they identify as queer in a way that means essentially not somebody who identifies as cisgender, so being not transgender, or heterosexual, right? Mm-hmm. So queer is nice because it's gender neutral language. Queer is also nice because it's a very all-encompassing ways, because there are so many ways somebody might identify as LGBT. They might be transgender and they identify as a lesbian, or many, many combinations. So queer has just become this kind of nice catch-all phrase.
Okay. So Q is almost replacement of the G, but you keep the G there.
So Q could replace the G. Q could replace Q could technically replace any of it. It's kind of this wild card. And when people do, occasionally you'll see written out, some people will add LGBTQIA, I for intersex, A for asexual, and it can go on and on and on. The reality is the entire acronym as it stands right now is like LGBTQIAAPP, 2DS, like,
Wow.
So it can be really, really lengthy. Queer is just this nice catch-all. I myself use queer because it sounds subversive, and I like that, but also because it just really is just kind of fits in a lot of ways.
So can non-LBGT people use the word queer? Can anyone, is queer acceptable for anyone to use?
So there's a lot of conversation about that within queer communities. I personally don't have an issue with it. Sometimes there will be folks who would, but I don't think anybody minds it when it's being used in a way that's positive. So if you were say you were hosting a podcast and you had a
Mhm.
panel and you said it was all folks who identify as LGBT in some form or fashion. You said
Mhm.
this is a panel talking about queer topics or with queer folks.
Mhm.
You know, you might want to ask and make sure everybody's comfortable with that. But for the most part, most people would view that and be totally fine with it because they would understand you're using it in a positive way. Now, that obviously hasn't always been the case, but for the
Mhm.
most part, it's pretty acceptable at this point.
So it's not like the N word.
No, it's reclamation language in the same way, but I don't think and we're not a monolith. There are some queer people who say, you know, cisgender heterosexual people should never use the word. I'm not one of those. I think that it really does work on a lot of levels, and it does work to kind of take gender out of it, out of the equation, and taking gender out of things is a really big focus for a lot of folks right now.
Yeah, I mean, well, before even getting into that,
Sure.
so because you said you, so are you one of the alphabets, one of the letters?
So I just identify as queer because that's easier to me.
Okay.
It depends on what spaces I'm in. If it really pushed on my identity, I have identified as bisexual. I have identified as pansexual, which is kind of falling out of vogue. Pansexual, historically, people were using it to mean I'm attracted to people of the same gender. I'm attracted to people of opposite genders. I'm attracted to people who are maybe agender or non binary, so they don't fit into the very binary male or female. But pansexual is kind of falling out of vogue because it doesn't mean anything that different from bisexual. I'm married to a woman, so occasionally I'll identify just as a lesbian, depending on what circles I'm in or how I'm talking. But I think queer has just kind of fit me because it can mean so many different things.
All right. So okay. So there's a lot of so transgender. So
Right.
break down exactly what transgender is.
Right. So to have conversations around transgender identities, there are some like key terms that we talk about. So transgender, so the way I always explain it is when all of us were born, the doctors or midwives or whoever delivered us took a look at our bodies and decided what our gender was, right?
Mhm.
So when I was born, they looked at my body, they decided I was a girl. Um, and for a
And when
lot
you
of
say look at
folks,
your body, you mean you have a
genitals.
vagina. You have a
Yeah,
vagina.
yeah, they look at external genitalia, and that's all they're making that decision on. So looking at external genitalia, and they're deciding this is who this baby is, right?
Mhm.
For a lot of folks, as they grow and come to know themselves and understand themselves, that does fit. For instance, I was assigned female at birth. They decided I was a girl when I was born, and as I've grown and come to know myself, I still identify as a girl. But for a lot of folks, and more, we're finding out more and more all the time, more folks than we ever imagined, that's not the case. The gender they were assigned at birth doesn't fit. And I think a common misconception, since we're talking about misconceptions, is that kids can't know that very young, right? But all the latest data and research says that gender identity is formed between about 18 months and 3 years. Some of the even more conservative estimates say possibly up to 5 years. But every major medical organization, psychiatric organization agrees that gender is determined very, very young. For most of us, we didn't think about it. You know, I never, at 18 months, when they called me a little girl, that didn't stick out to me. At 3 years old, you know, it didn't feel incongruent to me. It felt fine and normal to be called a girl. So I never really thought about my gender much. It just was what it was. But for a lot of folks who are transgender, so they don't identify with what they were assigned at birth, that can be very, very uncomfortable. That incongruency can range from everything like, why is this happening? Why are people calling me something that I'm not? To just a feeling of something feels off about this, and maybe they can't articulate it. You know, very young children without access to language around this might have a really hard time articulating it. And a lot of this goes back to just this idea that gender is a very individual thing, and it's totally separate from what we're assigned at birth. So it's totally separate from things like biological sex. It's totally separate from expression. It's totally separate from sexual orientation. It has nothing to do with any of those things, right? Gender identity stands alone as its own unique thing. So folks who do not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth often would identify themselves as being transgender, or that's how we would define somebody who's transgender.
So the difference, because most of like some of the word, even some of the words you're using, people that's probably other than people that already know that's watching this probably don't know
Yeah,
some of the words that you're
for
using.
sure.
And I mean, me as older person, like I talk to people, and just a lot, just knowing you, I feel like I'm in a line where I know, being a black male in his 40s,
Right.
you know, you have people that like if someone, and I have strong parts of it. I have very strong feelings, also being a black male, but that's more so the how things are presented, which when we were younger, we had a lot of those conversations.
We did.
But, one, just broader, growing up, there's a girl out, there's a guy, you have tomboys,
right?
And then you have like sissies or,
Mm-hmm.
Or just effeminate in the Black community. A lot of a popular term was sweet,
right?
Having something sweet, and that might mean they're gay. They might not. They just might be a little bit more effeminate,
right?
And you're from kind of what you're saying. All those things are just a lot broader. There's a lot more shades of gray than
absolutely
men. So why is this a thing now? Why is this a thing now? Because from outside looking in, I feel like it's because of technology.
It feels brand new, right?
People, yeah. And I feel like also people who are like you in that world, y'all don't. When I say y'all, people that's in the world don't realize when you're talking to people not in that world.
Right.
Because people that's watching this don't know what cisgender means.
Right.
Meaning, like, because we had it might have been a year ago when there was a transgender in GameStop and they went off.
Right.
And I mean, and I feel like I understand their anger, but I also feel like you have to understand that people that are not in their world, that is I mean, it's a minority group for a reason. Is that people don't know these terminologies.
Right.
They don't like. I don't know. Like, there's I might see a masculine looking woman,
right,
and just listening to you, me saying that could be wrong because what is masculine? I mean, so pretty much, like, I feel like, and to wrap up kind of my thoughts, and I'm sure you got a lot to feed off of that.
Yes.
But what you're saying and the things that you're talking about are pretty much rewriting, I would say, anyone that's been grown from almost probably before the 2000s.
Yeah.
You're trying to rewrite what we were taught and how we were raised.
Yeah. Language evolves and our understanding of things evolves. So you said a lot of things that I want to touch on. So I think the first most important thing to go back to is there have been a ton of studies done that have proven that any conversation or training that happens around transgender identities that's shorter than 3 hours leaves people with more bias than they came in with. So I was a former trainer, and that's one thing that I always like to name up front. So I'd like to name this now for you and for the folks who are watching this or listening to this is the reason why people can walk away with more bias is because it does feel confusing, and they're more likely to say, I don't get it. I don't even understand what they're doing. This is all very new, and they shut down and they just go with this is too much, right? And so it's important to note that this is the beginning of a conversation. It's not the end of a conversation. It's certainly not all encompassing. So you mentioned cisgender, so I want to define that really quickly as I identify as a cisgender woman, meaning I still identify as the gender I was assigned at birth. So cisgender is just the opposite of transgender. And to speak to whether or not it's new, people are coming out like they never have before, but we certainly know that transgender folks have existed for a long time. We also know that gender as we know it is a relatively new, not shockingly, Eurocentric idea, right? So we know that in the Torah, which is an old ancient Jewish text, there were 6 genders named. We know that Native Americans often identified numerous genders. When I did the whole acronym, I said 2S at one point. That's for two-spirit. So folks who are two-spirit in Native American cultures and some Native American tribes being identified as both male and female, and that was widely understood and known and accepted. So our idea of male and female is really Eurocentric anyway, and really something that's been kind of pushed a lot more recently. It hasn't been around since the beginning of time, right? So I think that's interesting to know because we know that if we take that out of it, then we recognize that it can be a whole wide spectrum. So when we're thinking about that, I think one of the questions I heard you asking is, why is this happening now, right? And you said technology, and I think you're right in that folks are able to find people who think like them and feel like them and have some language around how they feel like they never have been able to before because of the internet. I did a training one time and had a room full of high school students, all queer high school students. And I asked them, this was about 3 years ago, and I said, how many of you figured out you were queer when you were on Tumblr? And every hand in the room went up, right? And they realized that they were able to find people who thought like them, who felt like them, and they didn't just feel weird anymore. So historically, LGBTQ folks from all areas, not just transgender, often felt like there was something wrong or they didn't fit because they didn't see themselves reflected in representation. And so now they're able to go online and they're like, oh, that's what I am. am, right? That's who I am. That's how I feel. I've talked to a number of transgender people who knew they were transgender before the internet. So people who are like 40 and up when they didn't really have those forums to go on. And they said, I always knew something was off, or often, probably not all of them say this, but a number I've talked to anecdotally have said, I knew something was up, but I didn't have language for it. I didn't know how to explain who I was. And so once they've been able to put language to it, they've been able to say who they are. And so that's the reason why. And so 5 years ago, they said, well, there are probably about 700,000 transgender people in America. Then they said, well, there are probably about 1.4 million transgender people in America. And now we know that in a CDC, the CDC is pretty reputable. The CDC says that in studies they've done, about 1.8% of high school students know for a fact they are transgender. So that means potentially 2% of the population could be transgender. So now we're looking at huge numbers. 1 in 50 folks may identify as transgender. So this isn't new. It's just people having access to language and being able to share who they are like they never have been able to before.
Well, speaking of language and not new,
Yeah.
Again, younger, there was a popular, I wouldn't say popular, well, a term, and I think it's also a slur, was tranny.
Mm-hmm.
So someone, because to laymen,
Mm-hmm.
someone like a man, someone who identifies as a man or who appears to be a man dresses up as a woman.
Right.
That's a cross-dresser, or you would think maybe a transsexual.
Right.
So kind of break down like the differences of that. Why is that a slur, or is it a slur?
Yeah, for sure. That's one I'm not even comfortable saying. We would say the T slur, right? So shortened version. So transgender is the most widely accepted term. Transsexual was for a long time and has really kind of fallen out of popularity because the sexual part implies sexual orientation, which people get really confused about.
I was going to get to that a little bit.
Yeah, it also implies it's very medical sounding, and a lot of folks didn't like that. So some people may choose to identify themselves as a transsexual, but I would never call somebody a transsexual, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, this goes back to people are free to. Some people may call themselves what I consider the T slur, right? Some people that may be how they're comfortable. That can be very intergroup. That can also be reclamation language, but definitely not reclamation language that anyone who's not transgender should ever use. So I think that there was one other point you made that I wanted to address, and that was
cross-dressing.
Cross-dressing. So the difference between cross-dressing is really different. So cross-dressing would typically be somebody who, so like a man who identifies as a man who is assigned male at birth, who may feel comfortable wearing more feminine things, right? So he may feel more comfortable putting on like pantyhose and a dress. Typically, cross-dressing has other motivations besides gender identity, but it's kind of similar to if I put a dress on you right now, you would still very much feel like a man, right? That wouldn't change the fact that you are a man through and through. That is your gender identity, and I can only say this because I know you, so I'm not making assumptions. But that you identify as a man, so you would be in that case a man who would be cross-dressing, right? So presenting as something else. So that's one other component of this gender expression. So we look at the 4 big pieces that make up identity. We have gender identity, so that's your innate sense of self. That's who you are. So I know myself to be a woman, you know yourself to be a man. That's our gender identity. Then we have gender expression. My gender expression probably leans a little masculine, right? I'm like in jeans and sneakers and t-shirts most of the time. That's how I'm most comfortable. But that doesn't say anything about my gender identity, right? I still very much identify as a woman. So we have gender identity, gender expression, biological sex or sex assigned at birth. Again, as I mentioned, for me, that's a woman, a girl, and then sexual orientation. So all these things operate independently of each other, and that's what's really confusing because there can be like infinite combinations.
Yeah, because another misconception that not even through you, just through like old former coworkers and just people, and just because as someone from the outside looking in, you would think someone who was born, let's say if you were born a man and then you transitioned to a woman,
right?
You would think they were also, well, while they were a man, they were gay,
right?
And that's not all. That's not like, I guess the poster child out there is Bruce Jenner,
right? So we definitely want to refer to her as Caitlyn Jenner, but you're right. That's who she was formerly. Yeah. I know you know. I was going to say, I have an immediate reaction to that.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, Bruce Jenner, who transitioned to Caitlyn Jenner.
Right.
And originally, because I think Caitlyn is now dating a black male.
Is she?
Or she was. It was. I don't know.
She was dating like a 21-year-old woman for a while too. After.
Yeah, but that's what I was going to say. Originally, in my personal, what I've seen personally, people who transition is similar. So I personally question it, but
Mhm.
I know my world is smaller than the
Right.
people that you, but and I'm not finishing sentences. So pretty much, uh, typically, so someone who identifies as a different sex, they might not necessarily their sexual preference might not change. Is
Yeah.
what you're saying.
Yeah.
But is it common that it does?
Not. I mean, it's hard to say because transgender folks aren't really studied that frequently or in that way. Um, for the most part, not really. It's most people are attracted to who they're attracted to. You find, and that doesn't change regardless of transitioning. I've read a fair amount of research on this that has been done, and it's really limited and it's really unclear. But I wanted to address a couple of things you said when you were talking about Caitlyn Jenner. So the reason why I cringed when you mentioned her former name is because that's information that should never ever be shared. I post about this a lot on
Which
Facebook.
part?
Her birth name. So we all know it. So when I say Caitlyn Jenner's birth name, there's not a single person hearing this or listening that doesn't immediately go to what it used to be. But that's information that we would never use. So when I think about this a lot of times, I always say it's kind of like how we don't refer to a time that the earth was flat, right? We know that there was a time we believed the earth was flat, but it wasn't. We were wrong. So Caitlyn Jenner was
Well, some people would disagree with that.
some people disagree, but they're in the very small minority, and we can't talk about flat earthers today. We don't have that kind of time. But so we go back to, but I think you and I agree that the Earth is round and has always been, or some kind of circular shape, right? And has always been, or spherical, right? It has always been. So I wouldn't say, back in the 1300s when the Earth was flat, it wasn't. We were just wrong. So it's similar to saying that. So hold on.
Okay.
So it's similar to saying Caitlyn Jenner wasn't born a boy. She was assigned male at birth. The doctors got it wrong, right? They looked at her body, they looked at her external genitalia. I'm assuming she was born with a penis. They said, this baby has a penis, this baby is a boy. They didn't ask her how she felt. They didn't test her hormones. They didn't check her chromosomes. I mean, they didn't do anything around this at all to know that this was necessarily a baby who was a boy. I don't know at what age Caitlyn Jenner specifically came out. We obviously know when she came out publicly, but anyway, so they were just wrong. So language around saying things like she was born a, she wasn't. She was born a girl. They just were wrong. So we would say assigned male at birth or assigned, to be a boy at birth would be better language around that. And also, she didn't transition to being a woman. She always was a woman. She just began to affirm herself publicly. And sometimes transition brings up medical stuff. So some people do choose to affirm their gender by medical means.
When you say affirm their gender, what do you mean?
So when I say affirm their gender, it's like going back to using Caitlyn Jenner, because she's been pretty public. So Caitlyn Jenner knew at some point in her life that she was a woman, right? And she was ready to tell people she was a woman, and she was ready to live her life outwardly presenting as and experiencing the world as a woman. So we know Caitlyn Jenner, again, very public case. She had some surgery. She took some hormones, likely. I don't know her whole story, but I assume that's about how it went down. And then she began to live live as a woman, present herself as a woman. She had been, again, historically, even when she was an Olympian, she was still living as a woman. That's just not how she was able to publicly portray herself or how people were experiencing her. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
I understand the word that you're using. So, and to clarify, so what you're saying is, and there was different things that you said that I kind of picked up on it.
Right.
But some of the stuff is your personal life, and don't want to really touch too much on that.
Yeah, we probably don't have that kind of time, huh?
So you're saying, Caitlyn, because
Yeah.
whether I didn't bring up their sexual orientation at all.
Right.
I just said Bruce, and
Yeah.
and so I feel like if you're identify them, that person, and that's when I was going to stop you. That period of time, no matter what the world knew that they identified as, they were still Bruce.
Right.
So I think that's where not only does it get confusing, it gets angry, because I feel like, I understand you have a right to be sensitive about it, but you should still also have, for the other people who don't know that journey, let's say, call it a journey.
Right.
If if you came in here, and I guess Lindsey is a neutral name, but I haven't seen you since you look like this, and you let me know that you identify as a masculine or male.
Right.
That is, the transition is on me.
Right.
As much as you, but
I wouldn't say as much. So hear what you're saying,
then,
and you mentioned this before with the GameStop thing as well.
Yeah.
So I want to point out that marginalized people, we just have to listen to marginalized people, hear their experiences. We can't live their experiences. We can hear their experiences, and we can figure out how to support them in other ways. So the GameStop woman, I don't think she was angry the first time she was misgendered. We don't know because the video, that recording, picks up probably about halfway through or towards the end of the interaction. But we do know that they were repeatedly calling her sir. We see that in the video. They're repeatedly saying sir. When she's clearly becoming angry, she's saying ma'am, it's ma'am. And when I watched that, I was like, she should have, she was well within her right to be as furious as she was. If you were engaging with somebody, like say you were talking to me and I have a relative, again, I'm a more masculine presenting woman, but you read me as a woman and you misgendered me. So you said sir, and I would say, oh, it's ma'am. And you would say, sorry about that, and you would continue on. That's all people have to do. I've never known, I think there's this misconception that transgender people are really unreasonable, and it's not true. Transgender people are really marginalized, and they're dying they're dying from violence, they're dying by suicide, and it's pretty serious. So when we're talking about these things, I often say to people, the onus of getting this right, so the responsibility of getting this right is on us, right? It is on cisgender people, so people like you and me who do not identify as transgender. It's on us to get it right, because transgender people are in situations and in spaces where everything, the whole world is kind of against them, right? The whole world is scary for them, from bathroom debates, I'm so sick of talking about bathrooms, but obviously a big thing in North Carolina, though it's happening everywhere. It just happened on a national scale in North Carolina, to going out of their house, to leaving going to the store. Every place that transgender folks are feels like a threat. And I think that a lot of marginalized people feel that, in a lot of ways.
And no offense.
Yeah.
For the most part, depending on where you are, transgender, you pick any of those initials, they can, and that might lead to the suicide and all that stuff, and I get that.
Right.
But as someone who is a black male, I don't know. I can't hide the fact that I'm a black male.
Right.
Well, if I'm driving a car and it's a nice car in a certain neighborhood, and there's someone who, whatever, the likelihood of me as something, and it's not, and I'm not trying to make it like us versus them or anything like that.
Right.
But when you say that, it's like, to me, I just feel like it doesn't hold as much weight because, and I'm saying this because I've heard other people say it, not saying it's a choice almost, like it's a choice to be identified. Some to a degree.
So for transgender folks, sometimes transgender folks,
and not just, I'm just talking about the whole like
LGBT.
And you have a style,
right.
This might be a very old school way of looking at it. Like even like my hair, I was talking to somebody I was in the army with, and I was like doing something with my hair, and they said it's nappy. But like for he was a former Marine. We were in the army together, but for me that they like, well, you wouldn't feel if someone called you nappy. I was like, or told you to sit up or sit down. Now I was like, well, first of all, if anybody, I'm a grown man. If somebody told me to sit down, I'll have a problem with that anyway. Who are you to tell me that? But
right.
But yeah, that for me that is a choice. Like if someone has dreads, and and that prevents them from getting a job. And you live with that choice. That's not saying it's right, but you have they have the option to cut those dreads if they feel to get them that job. Where if I'm driving down a certain neighborhood or whatever, I don't have the choice not to be black.
Right. I definitely hear what you're saying. I think it's interesting because a lot of this comes back to this idea that I always focus on of like liberation versus assimilation, right? So somebody could cut their dreadlocks and get a job. Somebody could present.
And not saying that.
Present. And I know you're not. I know you're not arguing that they should.
Yeah.
Somebody could present less visibly queer, and it might make the world easier for them. Some people don't have that choice. Some people are not. Some transgender people are not assumed to be cisgender. So just living the world as they are, people are going to perhaps look at them and identify them as a person who looks visibly transgender to them. So that's not necessarily a a choice. Some people don't necessarily want to look cisgender, which I think speaks more to what you're talking about with the dreadlocks. Some people
Yeah.
choose to look visibly queer. I really fall under, with anything we're talking about, I fall under this idea that we always want to be working towards liberation, not assimilation. That means marginalized people shouldn't have to fit into the dominant culture.
And they should.
And I know you agree. I know you agree with me on this. But I think that one of the things that I think is so interesting when you're talking about this is you said it's not like an us versus them. And I think that we talk about this a lot in groups I work in. We talk about oppression Olympics, right? So who is more oppressed? Ultimately, we know that Black transgender women are really marginalized and often victims of violence, very disproportionately victims of violence. So what you're discussing around race is really relevant in LGBT spaces as well.
Well, yeah, and I'm sorry to cut you off.
That's fine.
And if you want to jump back in, whatever. But we all know there's a certain climate going on that affects all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say, like, whoever the PR person for the LBGT, am I saying it right?
LGBT, it doesn't, it's,
You know,
some people say GLBT, but I say LGBT.
I wish Black people could have them, because y'all do great PR. You have, like, you know what I mean? It's, y'all have made I say y'all, is that okay if I say y'all?
Yeah, it's okay.
They have made strides in the community, but I feel like, and I don't personally feel like it, because I'm not active in any of these worlds, but people that I do follow that are like active in like the Black community, and when there's something that happens to even like a Black woman, and it maybe even a transgender or a lesbian or Black woman, I feel like y'all are not there for us as strong as, and it's so this is so weird to say, one of the more fitting, someone that fits that profile or whatever, which is so weird because we're talking about minorities of minorities, but you know what I mean, that fits their imagery,
right?
You know, it's like, and I've had a talk with actually a mutual friend of ours that kind of shed some light on how thinking about it on our own, because I know in the Black community all this is very shunned, and I forget that, and I feel like there's reasons, and I probably don't even have time to get into that whole side of things, but just the portrayal of and why and all that.
Right.
And I'm gonna let you go from there.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, one of the things I think you're addressing and talking about is something that you say the PR people for the LGBTQ community. One of the things that we have to name here, and it would be disingenuous to not name it, is the people who have done the PR, the people who have visibly led the LGBTQ movement were white men. They may have been gay men, but they were white men often. It's a movement that has very strongly been headed by white folks, and white supremacy protects a lot of queer folks, right? And I think that when we talk about, when you're talking about communities of color and their reception towards LGBT people or the things that happen there, I think that one of the things that I always say, what I talk about with my folks I work with, is we have to talk about the racism that happens in LGBTQ communities, right? That's really important. LGBTQ spaces are really challenging for a lot of folks to navigate who are living at like the intersections of racism and homophobia or racism and transphobia. And that's why I mentioned Black transgender women, because everything I do at my center and everything that, LGBTQ folks should be doing is looking around a space and figuring out, is this safe? Is this space safe for Black transgender women? And if it's not safe it shouldn't be safe for any of us, right? That's what we should always strive to do. We should always be striving to achieve that. Now, that's aspirational. I think in a lot of ways we're a long way from that. I think as a white cisgender woman, I'm not the best person to answer that, but that's why it's really important that we're always answering to people of color, and that we're always making spaces where folks who are folks who are not feeling welcomed by their birth families or their biological families have spaces where they can come and find safe space. And that happens, across the board. But I mean, white supremacy is palpable in everything we do, right? It's a part of everything we do. And queer communities have come a long way because oftentimes the visible spokespeople have been white cisgender men, albeit maybe gay men, but white men. And white men, have a lot of privilege, whether they're marginalized in that one way of sexual orientation or not.
Yeah, and I mean, the stereotype, if it's a gay white man, usually the stereotype is very positive. Usually they're well kept.
Yep.
They have money,
Yep.
affluent. I mean, like, look at the stereotypical place, San Francisco,
Absolutely.
versus across the bridge, the stereo. And I've never been there, but just what you think of San Francisco versus Oakland.
Right. For sure.
You know.
For sure. And it's so true. I mean, we think a lot of times, double income, no kids, right? So gay men who have money. I mean, I don't know if it's still true, but when I lived in Wilmington, my boss was a gay man and he owned a good portion of downtown back then, and he was a white gay man who was doing a lot to further the rights of white gay men. But I promise you, in none of his the businesses he owned, the places, he was never thinking about what was happening to queer people of color, right? And that just wasn't on his that wasn't on his mind. And so I think that's something really interesting. I have people often ask me to comment on it, like, what do you think? Because I do a lot of speaking and training. What do you think about homophobia in like the Black community or the Latinx community? And every time I say, what do you think about racism in the LGBTQ community? I mean, that's what we really need to be talking about. It's not my place to discuss, what happens, for and in communities of color. But I know that for people who, it would be very tough to walk into any LGBT center, possibly in the country, and really find a space that is inclusive to Black trans women all the time, unless they're owned by and run by Black transgender women, which there are some spaces like that.
Okay. So is there any topics that I didn't ask you, or any other misconceptions that you want to tell us, or is anything that we didn't, you feel like we didn't cover or I might have missed?
So one of the things I think that we kind of touched on a little bit, but I wanted to state pretty clearly, is the only thing that people who are listening to this, or the only thing that you need to know, is just to affirm people in who they say they are. Very rarely are people ever offended when somebody's trying to do the right thing. I mean, I can even think about that. I think you can relate to that, because I know conversations we had 15 years ago where I would say things that were wildly inappropriate or wholly incorrect when we would have conversations about race, and you would be we knew each other, we had a rapport, you knew where I was coming from, and we could talk through a lot of those things. Not that that's always your responsibility, but that you did take that on with me a number of times. So similarly for transgender folks, I think that if you were in a situation, if you're at a restaurant or wherever, just interacting with folks, and you misgender somebody or say something that maybe they deem offensive, everybody is okay with just saying, I'm sorry, and correcting yourself and moving on. So if you say, ma'am, and they say, it's sir, just, sorry about that, sir. Additionally, thinking through things like not saying ma'am and sir, because we run the risk of misgendering people. I know we're both born and raised Southerners, so that's like a
it's just like, but I don't. Because me knowing, I don't even want to say that. I don't even want to.
It's not really necessary.
Yeah.
So it's funny because I go out to eat often with a lot of my colleagues who are transgender, and when we go in, I notice every single time servers make an assumption. You probably experience this too. You'll think about it now that I'm mentioning it. How often servers make assumptions about the gender of the folks at the table. So they'll be like, "Hey, ladies, what can I get you today?" And oftentimes, like 3 of the people sitting at this table are not ladies. You just guessed. I'm sure if you go out with your guy friends, they'll come over and be like, "Hey, guys, what can I get you?" Or whatever they may say. And so it's really interesting. Like just taking gender out of our language is something that a lot of people are uncomfortable with, but it's easier once you get in the habit of it. But also just really recognizing that, like I said, I think most folks know the transgender movement has come a long way in a very short amount of time. I mean, that's just a fact. However, it's still so challenging, and I don't think that this is an either or, right? I don't think this is a protect this marginalized group and not this marginalized group. I think it's really recognizing that we are in a really tough space where it's so important that marginalized people are coming together and looking out for each other and having these conversations, if that makes sense.
Okay. And so where can people find out more information if they want to either like reach out to someone like you or just find more information out? Like we'll probably try to have some links in the bottom, but just for people that's watching,
sure.
Where can people find out more info, or someone that is, finding information for themselves?
Right, absolutely. So there are a few really great websites. So there's an organization called Gender Spectrum, and their website is genderspectrum.org. And Gender Spectrum has tons and tons of resources. So it has a resource tab, and then there are links for people who work in education, for people who work in healthcare, for people who work with teenagers, on and on and on. And so within those links, I mean, there's lots of information about how to support students, or whatever, medical settings, whatever applies to what they do. And Gender Spectrum has a great way of really spelling things out. They are based in the Bay Area, so they're a little more progressive than we probably see in where I am in Wake County or where you see in New Hanover County, but they really do have like best practice language in there. And I think that's a really great site. I don't know of the local LGBT organizations in Wilmington, but I know
it's not
that
like a local show, so they don't have to be low. Just
that's true.
But just in general, yeah.
Yeah, just in general. Gender Spectrum's a great one. We're at LGBT Center of Raleigh.com for folks who are in the Raleigh area. And also, I think that the National Center for Transgender Equality is a great resource for folks who are coming out as transgender to know what their rights are, or folks who are maybe aren't just coming out but are transgender to know what their rights are. So that's
you even have to work on your verbiage.
Yeah. Oh, and that's the thing. It's like a constant learning. I mean, people think that everybody should just know these things, and they don't. I slip up on a daily basis.
And I think that's what some of the almost, especially for people who don't want to learn, that's where some of the anger comes.
It is.
Because it's like, I as me, and I speak more so for the people that are older than me, but I've been doing this for X plus years this way. Now you're telling me that it's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like if I had someone that helped me tend these crops for all these years, and now I got to tend the crops myself or pay someone to do it.
Yeah.
And you're telling me it's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think, and that's exactly what I mean when I say people may watch this or listen to this and feel more confused or more upset than they did going into it, and more like they kind of double down on their ignorance, right? And I will say ignorance, and they say like, no, this is too confusing, I don't want to know, or I don't want to do this. And the important thing is to just for everybody to remember that they're learning. I am in a totally different place than I was a year ago. I will be in a totally different place in my knowledge and understanding a year from now, and that's okay. And I do this for a living, so.
Yeah. So do you have any like social medias for yourself? Do you want anybody to find or follow you or anything like that?
I don't know. I've never been asked that question. I would say follow LGBT Center of Raleigh on social media and keep up with the cool stuff we're doing there.
How can you find that?
So we're LGBT Center of Raleigh.com, LGBT Center of Raleigh on Instagram and on Facebook. It's pretty easy.
Okay.
I don't know what our Twitter is, probably the same, but we don't want to do much with that. So we're always really working very hard to continue to expand our program offerings, but also putting a strong focus on equity, because that's, as I mentioned, something that's been missing from LGBTQ communities for a long time.
And you can find me on the IMoLT podcast YouTube. Hopefully that's where you're watching it. Hit subscribe, like, share with your friends, comment. Not a lot of people be commenting. You can also find us on Instagram, IMoLT podcast on Instagram, Inquisitive Mind of Lewis T on Facebook, and the IMoLT stands for Inquisitive Mind of Lewis T. For sponsor inquiries, or if you want a spotlight done on you, you can email us at mindoflewist@gmail.com. Thank you for watching, especially if you made it this far.